Welcome to the Working World. I'm Keryn Mendez.
And I'm Jamie Lingham.
Jamie, wow, what a session we have today for everybody. Roger Baxter, the CEO from the Minerals Council of South Africa, just took us through zombie economies, thriving economies, and everything in between. Amazing.
Yeah, absolutely, Keryn. I think that Roger's view, an economic view on the world's response to COVID, different countries' response and how certain countries will bounce out of it. And I suppose the benefits that mobility professionals can get, but also the things that they need to look out for to attract and retain overseas staff, but also to have a global workforce and ensure that they can still move people to the countries who may not have vaccinated as well or dealt with COVID as well as others.
Yeah, I mean, he spoke very briefly about the future of working hubs and how that's going to impact, our expat populations, the way we need to program our mobility policies and processes. And he also gave, I think, one of your favorite lines ever that I think I saw you smile, Jamie, which was saving lives and livelihoods. So something that we can all take forward.
I think the saving lives and livelihoods was probably one of the better catch cries I've heard as a result of COVID. But yeah, Keryn, I mean, look, the next, sort of 30, 40 minutes, I think that people will get a lot out of it. Roger's unbelievably well spoken. Personally, I reckon we could have spoken to him for hours on end, and you never get bored of hearing what he has to say. He has presented at top level G7 conferences. He's been, played key leadership roles in the mining industries, not only in South Africa, but also throughout the globe. And just interesting to see how much influence he's had and the council's had on shaping government policy in relation to the response to COVID. I just think it's a fantastic episode, and I'm sure everyone's going to really enjoy it.
Yeah, well worth a watch, Jamie. I agree. Enjoy, everybody.
Roger, welcome to the show. How's it all going over there in South Africa?
Jamie, greetings from our side of the world. It's a bit of a cold winter at the moment. We're in the middle of a third wave of our COVID crisis. Haven't quite managed to get as many vaccines as the Australians have, but we're working on it. But from the mining industry perspective, we've been doing what we call saving lives through all the preventative measures, but also saving livelihoods, getting back to work and earning the incomes for the economy. So it's been an interesting challenge, but we've also been very closely following what's been happening in other countries around the world, and we can be proud from the mining industry perspective of what we've achieved.
I love that slogan. Love it. Saving lives, saving livelihoods.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just to make the comment here, we unfortunately have in the mining sector had 413 deaths as of yesterday from COVID-19. We do employ 450,000 people in the sector, but our testing rate is double the national average, and our fatality rate is at 1.1% of the positive cases, 1/3 of the national average. So it just shows how our healthcare professionals, they're the real heroes of what's happened here. The people that go to work every day in deep level operations and in the mines have been our real heroes, including the ladies. We've got 52,000 women employees in the sector from nearly zero 20 years ago. And, they're the real heroes and heroines of what we've been doing in fighting this pandemic and getting back to work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Roger, for that overview of South Africa. It sounds like you guys are, especially in the mining sector, are quite advocate around testing, and certainly vaccines is, even Australia's got a while to come in relation to that. I think the UK and the US are probably leading the charge in that. So we've all got a little work to do just yet. I wondered whether, though, broader than South Africa, you could perhaps comment or provide us an overview around your view on the current worldwide economy, and perhaps who's performing better than expected in your view, and
Sure.
Perhaps who still has the worst to come economically.
So Keryn, as they say, once the economist is in the blood, you can't get the economist out. Yeah, obviously my role now, obviously as CEO of the Minerals Council, is much broader on the advocacy space, but certainly keep in touch very much with what's happening at the global level. So just to give a quick schematic, I think let's all face the facts. The COVID-19 crisis has caused a major humanitarian crisis with hundreds of thousands of people that have died around the world, many tens of millions being infected by the virus, but it's also caused the worst economic recession since World War II, which is obviously quite a serious challenge. I think the prospects for the global economy 2021 are looking a lot brighter. And that's mostly because, in a post-recession recovery, often what happens is you have a bit of a bounce that takes place. I guess as many countries, particularly the advanced economy countries, have put in place vaccine programs, put in place huge amounts of fiscal stimulus, what's happened is they've been able to open up their economies a lot quicker. And so what we're seeing is an expectation of a 5.6% growth rate. That's from the World Economic Outlook published a few days ago. But I think, the overall level of GDP globally is still 3% lower than the pre-crisis predictions. And I think if you look at the fiscal stimulus that's taken place, trillions of dollars, the vaccines and the vaccine situation has contributed to the ability of the global economy to recover. But I must say the recovery is what I would call a tale of a 4-track recovery. Just think about 4 different trains on 4 different tracks.
Sure.
With a better vaccinated emerging markets like China growing at 8.5%. The second area is around the advanced economies growing at about 5%, 5.3%, versus the less vaccinated emerging economies, excluding China, growing at about 4.4%. And then the poorly vaccinated, less or lower income countries, growing at about 2.9%. So I think it's about access to fiscal resources. It's about access to vaccines. It's about how business and consumer confidence have been negatively affected. It's about how economies have adapted to this whole process. And certainly from my particular perspective, I think, when you look at the likely outcomes, we've also had, by the way, obviously a significant improvement in commodity prices. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, agricultural prices, the rise in agricultural prices, while good for countries like Australia, has been negative for countries in the lower income brackets because of rising food prices. But the rest of the commodity suite, gold, platinum group metals, iron ore, coal, etc., have been good for exporting countries. Now, I think just a couple of comments, if I may, just say the fastest growth seems to be centered around East Asia and the Pacific, mainly due to China and Korea. For the lower income countries, the vaccination rates have lagged a lot. They are highly indebted. Many of them were fiscally stressed before the crisis actually hit us. And so they've got very subdued recoveries. And again, we've seen a significant decrease in per capita incomes, particularly in the low income countries. Something like 100 million people have gone back into extreme poverty from where we were 14, 15 months ago. I think the pre-COVID GDP levels in terms of recovery on a GDP per capita basis, China's already there, not just on a per capita GDP basis, but also on a pure GDP basis. China's already there. We're looking at the US, Korea, Russia, Japan, Germany being there by the end of 2021. So they're basically caught up to where they were pre-COVID. And then a number of what we call emerging and developing countries are still got a bit of catch up, looking at about a 3-year period for them to catch up. And then most of the lower income countries, you're looking at probably a decade for them to catch up to where they were. So, but the outlook is a little bit shaded. There are some risks that are out there. The outlook is mostly driven by countries' efforts to contain the virus, the faster rollout of vaccines, challenges related to what variants may emerge. As long as the virus is in circulation, you could see new variants emerging, as we've seen over the course of the last 14 months. And so there are some risks there. And even in a country like Australia, where you've had a severe, significant lockdown, the closing of the borders, there have been certain losses, 30 billion lost in terms of foreign students coming into Australia, $30 billion lost because those students are not coming into the country at the moment. Obviously, the tourist aspect, etc. But Australia has also taken a little bit longer than some of the other advanced economies to get the vaccines rolled out. And similar to that, China, South Korea and some of the Asian economies. And so they're going to remain a little bit more closed for a little bit longer until the vaccine process has rolled out. I think Australia, you're looking at 50% of your population being vaccinated by July is the expectation. So there's a number of different risks, but generally a better picture emerging. And but there's opportunities that we need to take and we need to pick up on, but we'll get into that in a moment.
I was just going to say, I've got 2 questions. So number one, just for the non-economists out there, what was the growth prior or pre-COVID? Was China still at 8% or were they at 10% or 12%? I'm just trying to put a benchmark to compare what you were saying, just to put it into context, because I actually don't know what the first half of that looks like. And I've got a second question for you in a second, but I just was curious on that side of things to put in perspective for everyone out there and myself.
Sure.
Yeah.
So China's economy had actually, for much of the last 3 decades, has been growing at rates of sort of 8-9%. In the last decade, the growth rates have slowed, and pre-COVID, they were looking at growth rates of just over 6.5%, Jamie. So 6.5%. So they, in the COVID year of 2020, their growth rate reduced to about 2.6%, which was still growth nonetheless. But for China, that was obviously a little bit of a disaster from their normal growth rates that they've achieved consistently. And then obviously they're looking at a growth rate of about 8.5% in 2021. Just shows you the not only the bounce back, but the fact that they've really benefited from the fact that while the rest of the world is under lockdown, consumers are out there spending on consumer goods items, which China's very good at making. So they've had a bit of an export boom on those sides of the, on those sides of their economy, but also reasonable fiscal stimulus and their ability to clamp down whenever outbreaks took place enabled them to keep their economy relatively open. So that's the Chinese example. But for the rest of the world, I mean, obviously average growth rates of about 3.5% to 4%. And just remember, when you're growing at a 3% level, you double your economy in size every 15 years. If you grow at 5%, you're doubling every 12 years, and if you grow at 7%, you're doubling every decade. So China's effectively been doubling its economy every decade on a consistent basis for over 3 decades, and that's why they are now the world's second largest economy. And probably within the next 5 to 10 years, China will have an economy, if they continue growing at this pace, the size of the United States.
Mind blowing. Now, the second, I suppose, question I had, and something that I've always wondered, these stimulus packages that are being money's just being pumped into economies, and what I'm finding is, we had in Australia, we had JobKeeper, and I know there's been similar schemes around the world, and as you said, trillions of dollars pumped into the economies, but it's basically printed money. And so I'm wondering, is that actually going to cause inflationary pressure? Once we start to stop these stimuluses, I think a lot of people have got a lot of money and they're buying a lot of stuff from the Chinese, and there's all these different factors in play. But to me, it feels like a bit of a false economy, really. And I just want to get your thoughts on how that operates, or how we get through this without having any sort of impact.
I think, Jamie, one of the big, the key differentiating factor between the global financial crisis of 2008-9 versus the current crisis is that the global economies are recovering a lot quicker. And secondly, the amount of fiscal stimulus that was pumped into the banking system during the global financial crisis and in the aftermath of the global financial crisis mostly resulted in asset price inflation, not necessarily general consumer good inflation at that particular time. More recently, what's happened is that the significant amount of money pumped into the economy has also resulted in a significant amount. I mean, if you just think about most people that are still in formal sector employment, particularly those that have been able to work from home, the levels of savings in the average household who are working from home has actually increased somewhat because people are spending less on other consumer-related issues, like, for example, fast foods, leisure trips, et cetera, et cetera. So the consequence has been quite a big increase in the savings of those sort of upper income households. So the net wealth effect has been quite big, but it's also gone into asset price inflation again, more than necessarily into other types of pricing inflation. So what my view is that we have obviously seen commodity prices picking up quite nicely, but that's been due to supply disruptions caused by COVID and obviously some constraints from an investment perspective in new mining operations and in farming activity. But secondly, also because of a degree of recovery in demand that's taking place around the world for various commodities, particularly in countries like China, where they still have a significant import component of their various commodities that they need for their industrial base. So what's likely to happen? We've definitely seen a pickup in inflation taking place in the last period. So there is a degree of price inflation creeping in, not just due to the fiscal stimulus packages and the extra money that's sloshing around the global economy, but also because of these supply-related issues that are obviously constraining supply of various commodities into the global marketplace. Is it likely to result in a massive increase in interest rates? The answer is no. It does pose risks for some of the emerging and lower income countries because they obviously have weaker balance sheets, they have depreciating currencies, and inflation is starting to rear its ugly head in those particular economies. And they do need the necessary monetary policy responses to those particular challenges. But at this stage, for the global economy, we're not seeing something which is going to cause, a significant inflationary bust that may take place at a later stage. I think the monetary and fiscal policy authorities have got it pretty much under control.
Yeah, Jamie kind of touched on it, Roger, around the incentives, and certainly in Australia, there's been lots of incentives handed out from a government, federal and I think state level, in relation to keeping a lot of small businesses open, particularly in Victoria, where Jamie and I are predominantly based. And I guess the term that kind of came about during that period was there were lots of zombie businesses out there that were trading that was predicted to not perhaps survive further waves, further lockdowns, or the next financial year. I wondered whether, playing on that thread a little bit, whether you have a view whether there are any, I guess, to use the same term, zombie economies out there that are probably still trading, that perhaps don't necessarily have as a brighter future, I guess, as some of the first world nations that we've just spoken about.
So, Keryn, it's the concept around a zombie company and a zombie economy is quite interesting. Obviously, the view of it is that a zombie company is very much a company which a whole bunch of money has been pumped in, but there's not very much chances of that company surviving. The short term. It's kind of like what they defined historically as incubator companies that you wanted to support, but if you kept them on life support for too long, you're basically supporting lost causes.
Sure.
So at a global level, listen, I think to answer the question specifically, the lower income countries all obviously are sitting there with very stressed balance sheets, very high public debt levels, very high repayments on both foreign and domestic debt, where they've got domestic capital markets. And that's one of the constraints that they face. They're also, I would also define as a zombie economy as an economy where the political leadership have failed to distinguish what policies there are in place that are hurting the ability of that economy to recover. So that's opening up markets, that's adopting more liberal private sector involvement in energy markets, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the low income countries are definitely facing a much more difficult stage at this particular point in time. They all are also still pursuing policies which are not necessarily massively liberalized or pro-growth policies. And so it's going to take a bit more time for them to recover. They generally tend to have less skilled populations. They tend to be obviously have less developed, sophisticated companies compared to the advanced economies. And there obviously are a couple of countries out there which are going to take an exceptionally long time to recover, just simply because they're in a complete economic mess. Countries like Venezuela, to name but one. And until you get real changes about how they can open up their economy, allow greater private sector investment to take place, liberalize their economy, they ain't going to get any growth back on track at this particular stage. The only benefit they're getting is from higher oil prices. So I would say that's the sort of situation. But clearly governments continuing with the objective of trying to support businesses that are likely to fail anyway is a no-win game. And in South Africa's case, we have more than 140 state-owned companies. The government in this country owns nearly 40% of the total fixed capital stock of the economy. And unfortunately, we have seen in the last decade hundreds of billions of rands or tens of billions of dollars being pumped into state-owned enterprises that have unsustainable business models. So I wouldn't say that South Africa is a zombie economy, not at all. We certainly are seeing quite a nice rebound right now. Probably a 4 to 4.5% growth rate is possible this year. But in those particular enterprises, I would have said it would have been better to have turned off the taps and really restructured those businesses to put them into sustainable business models. And that's a bit of a process that we're in at the moment.
I always like how people, and I definitely do it, and I know you did it, how you sort of say countries. I mean, companies. Sorry, you say companies. I mean countries. Everyone is running a business, right? I mean, a country is just like a business. And you mentioned that 100 million people are probably a lot worse off than what they were pre-COVID. Do you think that we're going to see more of a dip before things get better? And will the other, the G7, G8, all these companies, will they jump in to actually help those economies move further, or they just sort of let them naturally go through the process?
So, Jamie, I think we're going to see a continuation of the 4-track recovery process. So the advanced economies are going to still do quite nicely. Their growth rates will definitely slow in 2022, after the bounce of the dip from the dip of 2020. The emerging economies are going to continue. They will pick up at a faster pace the quicker that the vaccine process rolls out. And then obviously on the lower income countries, they simply desperately need help. They're not going to be able to do the vaccine processes themselves. So I think the concept around what was agreed at the G7 in the last few days about 1 billion doses getting to less developed countries as quickly as possible, this is an opportunity for humankind to show global solidarity. Because the fact of the matter is, this is not about countries competing with each other on a virus which could end up mutating in other parts of the world where the virus is not controlled and coming back to bite the very countries that have been successful initially in their vaccines campaigns. So this is one where global solidarity is key. Getting a vaccine rollout as comprehensively as possible. There are certain facilities that are being used. The COVAX facility is mostly targeting less lower income or less developed countries, and a lot of those obviously are located in Africa and a bit in South Asia. And so the point here is that as fast as we can, there's certain things that can be done, but there are certain surplus stocks that do exist in many of the advanced economies. I mean, countries like Canada and the US have ordered, multiple more doses than they actually require. And I think that getting those out into countries that haven't got access to the vaccines is critical. And we've talked about a number of advanced economies where the rate has been slow. And that's also been because of access to vaccines and obviously concerns about the efficacy of certain vaccines compared to the various variants that are in the countries concerned. But I'm certainly hopeful that as soon as practically possible, most of the advanced economies are likely to have achieved herd immunity or thereabouts by the end of 2021. But the fact is that we need to speed up the process in emerging and developing economies and the low-income countries. And hopefully by mid-2022, end of 2022, we're going to see those vaccines really having a positive impact. But I think this, again, demonstrates that the world itself needs to be much better prepared for these types of pandemics. And I think, if you think of COVID-19 on an annual basis, it's going to be kind of like the flu jab. You have to get a booster shot. There's going to be different variants that come out, but hopefully not different strains. It's when we get into the different strains that we've got a real problem on our hands. So I think that's where we're sitting. The vaccine rollout issue is going to really determine the pace of how countries are going to unlock. And then I think the last point to make is that there's no doubt that the lower income countries do need some help, but they also need to make some of their own real structural policy choices to get their own economies more open, more able to bring in foreign investment, because I'm not a great believer that foreign direct overseas assistance from other countries is the solution to long-term development. It's much more countries deciding themselves that they want to develop through a path of high economic growth, productivity growth, human capital development, etc. It's a public policy choice in many cases.
Thanks, Roger. We spoke a little bit about some of, I guess, those economies, and especially spoke about China, obviously being, the manufacturing hub and benefiting and growing out of all of this. I wonder whether you have any comments or thoughts around the impact, specifically to India after the recent very steep wave that they had, and how that perhaps has had a bigger, greater impact on worldwide economy. Obviously, India being a big services hub, especially in this region. It's something that I haven't seen anybody talking about just yet, and I wonder if you had any views on that.
Sure. So, I mean, Keryn, I think the way to look at India in particular is that very large population. Obviously, it had been growing at a very fast pace. It is expected to have a fairly fast recovery, but there's no doubt that the significant outbreaks and the record number of positive cases and then obviously deaths that they've had in India has really slowed down the economic prospects and forced the government in India to obviously continue imposing certain lockdowns in certain areas, over time. That has had a dampening effect on their economy, but I think we must put in perspective also that given the fact that quite a large portion of their economy is service-based and that they are becoming one of the sort of service hubs for the global economy, it hasn't necessarily detracted from their ability to continue operating from a remote perspective and servicing various of their global key customers. So again, if we're looking at telemetric services, telecall services, et cetera, the software backup services that many countries or companies use from an Indian perspective, those have not been as materially affected as obviously the sort of traditional, more labor-intensive, people at work sort of perspective, where you're talking about areas like construction or mining or others. Although in the mining space, obviously there's a lot more digitization and independent work that's now taking place. And I think, countries like Australia, United States and others have been leaders in that sort of area. So, I think on the Indian side, their ability to control the virus through the vaccination programs will open their economy up. They are expected to grow by something like 6% this year, which is obviously after their contraction of last year. But, they still got some way to go to get themselves back and operating at the levels that we saw before. And they still are an economy that needs further structural reform. There's too much government involvement in their economy, et cetera, et cetera. A very different case from China. China's sort of government-driven, liberalized approach to the way that they manage things is quite different to the Indian version. But that's just a thought from my side. I think the way that the world is changing and moving into this global mobility of work and how we are seeing certain hubs, you don't have to be physically located or geographically located in a particular area. And, when I certainly in a number of the studies that we've been looking at, the future world of work is no longer the future world. It's actually here and now. And that's what COVID has done. It's created this tremendous catalyst for people completely rethinking the way that work is conducted in the modern workplaces.
You read my mind, Roger. Well done.
Well, I mean, look, as someone who is traveling around and working remotely throughout Australia, I do agree that, without having to be hands-on, there's a whole new way of living and working and being present with a company. But I think that coming back to, your opening comments about how the South African mining industry has had, over 400 cases or 400 deaths, out of a population of over 400,000 workers. How has the mining industry got through COVID? And I suppose more importantly, you allude to the fact that other viruses could happen. And we interviewed Dr. Agnes Arnold Forster, and she said that, for an event like this to happen within the next 5 to 10 years wasn't unthinkable or unrealistic. And so I suppose what I'm saying is there's a two-speed conversation here. One is the people who can work remotely from anywhere, and the second is the people who have to turn up to work. And I suppose, how do you prepare for this to happen again, and how do you manage it successfully?
So, Jamie, certainly from my perspective, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from how we've managed the pandemic so far. And I think, mining is one of those industries where, given our significant focus on health and safety, and in the South African context in particular, how we've combated the tuberculosis pandemic, how we've combated the HIV/AIDS pandemic, we've taken a very much risk-based approach, identified what the key risks are, put in place all the preventative controls that we can put in place, and then looked at what the mitigating controls are if you do have various events taking place. So the way that we've managed the pandemic, and I just to reflect on it for a moment, is, in February last year, before the pandemic had been declared as a global pandemic, which only happened sometime, I think it was the end of March, early April. Mm-hmm. We had already circulated to our members both the WHO guidelines as well as our own National Center for Diseases Control guidelines on how to manage a pandemic if it got out of control at a country level or at a global level. And so by March, we had developed our own 10-point plan, preventative and mitigating controls. By April, we had developed a set of standard operating procedures operating with government, which ended up being gazetted by government as the guidelines for how to manage the pandemic. And just to show how successful our thinking had been, we were able to get most of the industry. We had basically 80% of the industry back and operating by the end of May, having been in a hard lockdown in April. And just looking at the success of it, we then worked on our collaborations with government, the Mines Inspectorate and the different government agencies about what we could do about treating people, making sure that, in terms of all our preventative controls, all the screening was done, if necessary, testing, if necessary, isolation, quarantining, making sure that all the right personal protective equipment was in place, making sure that everyone had access to sanitizers, social distancing guidelines were followed, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we even went as far as our companies helping community-based radio stations, working with communities, just spreading the message about the preventative controls, because prevention, obviously, in this type of process is much, much better than cure, because cure is obviously challenging and obviously has huge negative impacts. So we were able to get a lot of people back. We helped the public healthcare system. We helped with the rollout of particularly food parcels and others to indigenous communities that were facing real hardships and struggles. But at the same time, this whole process around saving lives and saving livelihoods. So Jamie, I think if you look going forward, the world is going to face future pandemics. That's just the nature of what's going to happen. But what the last 14 months have showed us, and our history over the last 10 years, getting our health and safety record to the best on record in 130 years of the recorded history of the mining sector in 2019. We have regressed in 2020, and that's, we think, a bit related to certain mental related challenges related to COVID, depression, anxiety. There's a few things that we can talk about from a workplace impact perspective. But having put that all in perspective, we've used these systems, and these systems will serve us well going forward. And maybe a last point to make is, our systems that we adopted from a South African perspective, given our very large labor force, we also kept 60,000 employees at home. So we brought back about 390,000 people back to work. So anyone who had comorbidities, et cetera, and that's why we were also successful in making sure that we kept the death rate as low as possible. We wanted it to be zero, but I'm afraid that's not reality. But our lessons and what we've learned through this means that when we get to the next pandemic, we'll apply the same risk-based approaches, putting in place all the right mitigating and preventative controls, but mostly working in partnership and making sure that people understand that they are part of the solution through their behavior, et cetera. And then obviously working closely with government on trying to find the sort of vaccine solutions, which we've been basically doing as organized business for the last 6 months. So that's very much the way that we tackle it from our perspective. I can say that at an economic recovery perspective side, the mining sector obviously has recovered quite a bit faster. We've kind of like helped the economy get out of the hole it's in, no pun intended, because of the export earning base that we've created. Exports are up 24% in rand terms last year, even though mining production was down by 11%. But the fact that we didn't have tax rises in our budget in February was pretty much due to the fact that mining and other sectors had recovered quite quickly, and helped the fiscus, and obviously help save lives, saving livelihoods and saving lives.
Fantastic contribution you guys have made. And was that at a South African level, or was that globally?
So that was at the South African level.
Wow.
Keryn, what I can say also is that at the global level, I think the sector's played a very similar role. What we can be proud of is as South Africa is that our standard operating procedures were downloaded over 40,000 times from our website. And we did engage with a large number of business associations in the Southern African region within South Africa itself. And then obviously at the global level through the International Council on Mining and Metals, there was a lot of sharing of ideas, not just from what we were doing, but also we were learning what the Australians were doing, what the Canadians, Americans, the Latin Americans were doing, etc. And so that shared experience of leading practice on managing and dealing with the pandemic was shared at the ICMM level. And I think that shows real leadership as the mining sector of how we fight the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the nice things that's come out of COVID, and we're certainly seeing that across the mobility sector as well. A lot of, this very podcast was born out of Jamie and I having discussion around the need to collaborate, the need to share knowledge, the need to share initiatives, so that we can all, I guess, benefit and to your earlier point around take the learning and optimize from there to manage moving forward. You touched on earlier around a piece that's been playing on my mind around hubs. And we see the classic kind of working hubs, especially in APAC. You've got your Singapore, for example, And so I wonder whether with this kind of rise of the global workforce that you spoke about briefly before, I wonder whether we'll see a shift in hubs where, because of economic reasons, whether organizations will choose to move those hubs, move them to perhaps lower socioeconomic economies, or whether the strength of those existing and traditional hubs will see us through. What's your thoughts around that? From, I guess, selfishly from a mobility practitioner's point of view, I kind of want to insight into perhaps what's happening and where some of maybe the new hubs will pop up around the world.
So Keryn, thanks for that. I mean, and just one quick thought on the health and safety side before we move on to the mobility side is to say, the one thing that's really been quite a revealing issue is the understanding amongst the mining industry leadership at the global and local levels that health and safety is not a competitiveness issue. It's an issue that affects everyone. And this united view of the global mining industry leadership on the criticality of fighting COVID and saving lives and saving livelihoods has been quite a remarkable outcome of this COVID-19 process, as much as it has been a humanitarian tragedy. And so what it has also done is made a lot more people realize that mining is an industry that really does contribute to the societies within which people live and operate. And it's not all a negative contribution, it's mostly a positive contribution. And I think what COVID's done is demonstrate that this sector, mining, really does matter for the global economy and for societies all around the world. So getting back to your mobility question, I think clearly there are, the first point from my side to make is that what COVID has done has acted as this catalyst for this future world of work to start happening right now. And I think there's no such thing as a post-COVID-19 period in my view. It's what we call the new normal period. It's a new normal where, let's face the reality that business will change forever. It has been changed forever under COVID. There's certain professions and there's certain areas of work that clearly can be done remotely. There obviously are many different areas of work which have to be done physically. In the construction or building sectors, it's going to be pretty difficult to do that remotely unless we figure out machinery that can do that for us. But that's not likely to take place, at least in the short term. But even in industries like mining, where you traditionally have been a very people-centered but very physically driven industry, you have to be on physical location. There's a very strong recognition that as much as 30% of the work activities can actually be done remotely. You can operate a drag line or a heavy piece of mining kit or an underground mining tipper grader, vehicle from 1,000 k's away. You don't have to be at location. You can do that through obviously 4IR technologies, et cetera. So, but then at the same time, I think there's also recognition that there's certain profiles and jobs that will become that are much more not only mobile, but they have changed forever, because again, if you want to attract the brightest and the best, it's no longer about whether you can attract the talent, it's also where that talent can locate itself and also continue contributing. It might want to locate itself, in a hub in Singapore or in Malaysia or something like that, but for a company operating out of Perth, so we know that those are the sort of things that are taking place. So, but the point is that it's mostly the more higher end, more skilled jobs. It's in financial services. It's in a number of those types of services which are very driven by the ability to be able to operate remotely without having to be physically on site using this sort of technologies. So you asked a question about the hubs, where the hub's going to be located, etc. I think that the traditional hubs will grow their presence over time. So I think the Singapore's as a financial hub, financial and marketing hub into Asia will certainly continue as a key mobility hub. And I think India the same. I think over time you'll find Africa will serve as more of a hub into Europe, because there are similar languages that are spoken, particularly on tele-related services. And so that'll be an interesting, and that's a more of a time zone issue, because again, one of the challenges obviously in some of the hubs is that if you're 4 or 5 hours out of the time zone, there are some challenges related to time zones and working hours and a few other things there. But my view is that the traditional hubs will remain key players and probably grow their presence. But what's happened is that in many of the advanced economies, given the fact that it's up to 25 to 30% of workforces now, particularly the highly skilled workforces, or parts of the workforce will work through hybrid systems, mostly remotely. They're going to choose to locate where they want to. I mean, why would you want to be sitting in New York when you can be sitting in Boston or sitting in Denver, Colorado, from an operating perspective? And so that's my view of the shift that's going to take place. So the way that we think about this future world of work and how it's hit us right now is a change that's profound, and how we optimize it is going to be, I guess, the question that you might need to ask me in the next round.
That growth you spoke about, say again, Singapore for an example, do you mean a physical presence growth? Because I guess one of the things that we're seeing play out at the moment, and Jamie, feel free to jump in here because this is more your territory than mine, is we're seeing protectionisms moving in for many economies around the immigration programs. So once upon a time, there might have been a role, perhaps some in Singapore, that they're now saying we're only taking Singaporeans or locals with visas. So do you see that growth of that hub being a mix of virtual and physical on the ground?
Jamie, you want to jump in there, and then I'll come in there from Keryn's side?
Yeah, Keryn, I think that's a fantastic question, because as you said, the life of the expat, or what used to be the expat life, is quickly disappearing. And I'm also interested on Roger's thoughts, if people who are running mobility programs, if this creation of these hubs and the outcomes due to COVID might actually reignite that sort of expat lifestyle, or if it's going to be, if we think it'll be sort of more a remote online proposition.
So my take on it is, what's going to happen is that you've got obviously these hubs that are already well established, and you've got a number of different experts that come in. And I mean, a number of the countries have obviously opted for imposing severe restrictions, mostly to control the COVID environment. Will those restrictions remain? My view is that those restrictions will be lifted over time. But again, what the virtual platforms do is give us more options about where location can take place. So. And again, it's going to be much more based on personal choice, but you have to have a degree of locality is important from the perspective of time zones, in my view. So you still have to have a degree of sensibility about where you locate your facilities. And again, I think some of these historic hubs, particularly a country like Singapore, using it as an example, many of the mining companies have their key marketing hubs operating from Singapore. There's a number of different tax reasons, but there's also location regions given, the East Asian region that they are marketing their particular products into. And so that's not going to change in the short term. But it may change to a certain extent, given the fact that you may be able to operate virtually from somewhere else if that's possible. But again, I think time zone related issues. For me, I think it's going to be much more about the ability to attract and retain talent is also going to be driven by where that talent wants to locate itself from a lifestyle perspective, where they want their families to grow up, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's an area that we certainly are thinking about and building into our equations. And I can talk from my own personal experience. I mean, we're going through a significant revision of our future world of work. We've worked remotely for 14 months. I've got 65 team members that report to me. A couple of them scattered 1,500 kilometers away, down in Cape Town and different parts of the country. And it's worked exceptionally well. In fact, I think our productivity has been higher than it was pre-COVID. The number of issues that we've dealt with, the progress that we've made on the engagement through virtual platforms versus the old traditional things has really worked really well. So my view is, again, it comes back to making sure that you can create the conditions where people are happy to be located in a similar zone, but at a place where they want to be from a lifestyle perspective. Being able to attract that sort of talent will become more and more important as we go forward. So just a quick thought from my side. I mean, again, it's an area that we're all thinking about, and it's going to change considerably. But I do think when you look at some of the study work that's been done by McKinsey, for example, they studied 2,000 different occupations. They looked at they tried to figure out which ones could be made or work more remotely, say 3 to 5 days a week. And they found that it was mostly the much more highly skilled, workers, and those more highly skilled workers do have choices, and those choices often are much more oriented towards, obviously, job satisfaction and being able to make a real difference is one issue, but the lifestyle choices of that work-life balance also comes in very strongly into the equation.
Absolutely. We're seeing Jamie play that out right now.
Yeah,
Exactly. I think that it's interesting, I've been fascinated by what you've been saying, Roger, and what's really coming through to me besides saving lives and saving livelihoods, which I've got to say, you've been a champion of that saying. I should be jotting down how many times you've said it. It's really sunk in with me and I love it. You should be saying it to, a lot of other governments around the world. But what's really impressed upon me is the fact that what you've been saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's really about the vaccine. It's really about the vaccine allowing the mobility of people again, or the movement of people. And I think that what it also is saying to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sort of first world economies, more or less, will have a significant advantage because, number one, the individuals will want to, and I think this is true, I think the individuals will be the ones who drive the moves as opposed to employers looking to drive a move. So someone will say, hang on a second, I was locked down in the UK for 6 months, the pubs weren't open, this isn't great. I want to actually move to a country that dealt with it a bit better. And so I suppose for companies that operate globally, it sounds like the challenges will not necessarily be moving people from South Africa to Australia to America. It will be moving people into those economies or countries that have had a much harder time of managing the virus, of managing the rollout of the vaccine. Would you say that's correct? That there's going to be a gradual rollout to normality, and I suppose that the inherent challenges that come with for mobility practitioners who need to move people to these economies who haven't managed so well, or these countries who haven't managed so well.
Yeah, listen, it's obviously going to be much more difficult to move people into those economies that have been slower in the rollouts. And so I think that obviously has had a significant impact on mobility. But again, it doesn't detract from the view of location lifestyle choices from an executive level perspective. And so I think it's kind of like more an advanced economy phenomenon where, if you've got 20 to 30% of the workforce able to work in hybrid systems remotely, and let's face it, we've had the catalyzed change, and it's a structural change in the way that people work. It's a structural change that is not going to be reversed anytime soon. In fact, my view, it's going to grow over time. And so when you look at this, bringing people across to different localities, those localities, so people are going to, for example, want to go and move to Australia or move to Cape Town, depending on what their specific lifestyle choices may be. They might want to go and live in Sydney because they enjoy the vibe of the place, but the mining activity might be taking place, of what they're directing, in Africa or in Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess the mobility practitioner concept that really plays in my mind is, how do we look at attracting and retaining talent in a way which meets their aspirational needs from a career perspective, and building it on where they also want to, raise their families and grow up and be in environments which they think are conducive for their own well-being, et cetera, et cetera. And that will vary from person to person. In the less developed economies and the developing economies, I think that process will be a lot slower. So the amount of people that can work in the digital world, the number of people that can work on virtual platforms will be a lot smaller, in my view, because they've still got to go through almost the equivalent of a demographic transition in the way that their economies are structured. Because again, look at the advanced economies. It's a significant high proportion of services, normally about 70% of those economies. And then obviously with high-end manufacturing and a number of other different components, including mining and others. Whereas many of the emerging and developing economies and less developed economies are much more reliant on sort of single sector tourism. So some of the island economies in the Pacific Ocean are tourism-based economies. You could even say that Spain is a lot more of a tourism-based economy than the rest of Europe, as an example, and they're going to recover at a much slower pace. But when you look at these economies, they've still got to go through their equivalent of a demographic transition from an economic development perspective. And when they do that over time, gradually more and more people will move across into those more skilled, mobile sort of technology-driven type occupations. And I think that's a transition that we'll probably see, over the next 20 years.
So just to that point, I just wonder if that's what your thoughts are, if that's going to affect wage pressures. Because obviously, what is my unique selling proposition if I wasn't a Sydney or a New Zealand, Australia or New Zealand or something, country that we're saying, or Singapore, that country's a bit more desirable to move through. Do you think that's going to increase wage pressures? And I suppose is that the only way to attract people into these developing countries, or people who aren't coming out of it as quickly?
Yeah, I think so. So my perspective would be, for the less developed countries or the developing economies, the risk that they face is that they end up losing a number of skilled people to the advanced economies. And that's been a pattern that's been taking place for the last 20, 30 years. So it's not new, but it may accelerate, under
there's some opportunity, right, for other developing countries maybe to get people back.
So the opportunity for getting people back, I mean, if you look at a country like South Africa, we've got a huge intellectual diaspora that exists in the rest of the world. And so, the opportunity of being able to tap into those skills using the capability of 4IR technologies and virtual capabilities is quite apparent, but it depends on whether the country governments are willing to try and bring back those types of skills. I still think that you're going to get a degree of physical people flow taking place, and it's mostly the skilled moving across to advanced economies, with some, depending on the countries. I mean, countries like Rwanda have been quite successful in attracting back their skilled intellectual diaspora from the rest of the world back to their country, given the fact that they've got much more progressive economic policies and they're growing their economy at a much faster pace, after the disaster of that genocide back in 1994. So you look at the changes that have taken place and the way that they've led the process. So Jamie, you're right. But what I do think is that this whole process around the modernization and future world of work and its arrival right now will be a little bit more of a gradual process for those developing and less developed countries compared to the advanced economies. The advanced economies have got, they've got a head start in the process. Yeah. And so the question is, how quickly can the developing economies and the emerging economies catch up? But again, when you look at it, I mean, China is an emerging economy, still defined as an emerging economy, even though I think it's kind of like emerged some time ago. The challenge, for them, they do have a huge Chinese intellectual diaspora around the world, being educated in the best universities in the world, including in some of Australia's top universities and those in America. But those youngsters go back to China, and they're driving a change there. Whereas I think what happens in other emerging economies, which don't have the same Chinese mindset, is the youngsters leave and go and get educated elsewhere, but then they don't come back. And that's the huge loss of capability, which is unfortunate for the developing world.
Definitely.
Yeah, Jamie, I agree with Roger in the fact that I think, it will slowly emerge over time. I think immediately what we'll see as mobility practitioners, where we want to incentivize people to go to some of those more developing or hardship locations, is you'll just see a recalibration of those hardship allowances, and probably to take into consideration those COVID scenarios, whatever given point they're at, whatever vaccine rate they're at, whatever exposure rate they're at, and whatever variant rate they're at. I think that'll be something. COLA used to be something that we watched quite carefully, and you'd adjust for your packages, right? I think the hardship locations and the COVID impact or the COVID allowances are now going to be what you watch more closely as a global mobility specialist. But the one final thing I wanted to ask Roger was, there's a thought, I guess, on the street that economies that have taken quite a big economic hit financially due to the outbreak will look to recoup that perhaps through taxes. And I guess one of the best ways to do that is through foreign visitors or foreign tax. And so I wondered whether you had any thoughts around comments around if you're seeing that in any countries already, and whether that will have any immediate or long-term impacts on any particular economies, or whether to your point, it'll just all gradually kind of blend back in over time.
Keryn, listen, I think my perspective is there are definitely fiscal pressures on a number of countries, particularly emerging and less developed countries. And quite a bit of the response is not to look at how they can cut expenditures. Often in these economies, there's a significant focus about how to tax more, which basically, I'm a great believer in the sort of Laffer curve economics, which basically the higher your tax rates are, the more incentive there is for evasion and avoidance. And your tax take tends to be lower. So there's a particular optimal point at which you have a nominal and effective tax rate, which is an incentive for people to invest and grow your economy. But there is always the short-term incentive. We see it certainly in the resource-rich economies. There are a number of resource-rich economies in Africa where they brought back private sector participants. A country like Zambia is a classic case. They brought back a lot more private investment in the mining space. But they have, it's kind of like the resource nationalism concept, where they've gradually increased the degree of taxes that the sector has faced over time. And there probably will be pressure from the multilaterals for them to increase taxes further, to try and balance their books instead of looking at what they can do to really cut expenditures. And the same thing in a country like South Africa, where we've been saying to government, whatever you do, it's not about taxing more. Taxing more is just going to create more economic hurt and harm in the short term. It's all about how you balance the budget, stop bailing out inefficient, wasteful state-owned enterprises, and look at reducing corporate tax rates, etc., to get the investment going. And this year's budget, we saw the Minister of Finance actually announcing a 1% cut in the corporate tax rate, specifically to do what's necessary to stimulate this investment, the supply-side economics investment process. So I think it's a difficult one. I also want to just say to you that there is this interesting new digital taxation tax, which has been proposed at the global level. You would have seen that it's been accepted at the G7 level, which is a sort of a minimum corporate tax rate for, it's mostly based on the fact that a number of the digital related economy companies, that specifically referred to Amazon and others, have paid not as much tax as others in certain jurisdictions, and they're expecting that in the areas where they have their major sales, they should be paying at least a minimum tax rate of 15%. Now, that's again an interesting debate. But I'm very much of the view that it's also a debate which doesn't take into account sectoral views. For example, at the commodity level, there are a number of countries where you mine is where you mostly pay the tax, and there's a view that that shouldn't change, at least in the short term. So anyway, that's a bit of a debate that I raised, because some of these different global tax issues are also going to potentially affect mobility issues, because again, if these virtual companies that was so attracted to Ireland with a very low tax rate of 12% now paying a slightly higher tax rate, it does change a little bit of the corporate thinking about where they may locate their particular facilities in the future. So that's a future area that we need to think about.
Absolutely. One for next time, Roger.
I agree with you.
Okay,
Sorry, just to just continue that point, Roger, I agree with you. I think that, it does, what we've found in Australia, they've rejigged how they're charging for sponsored working visas. There's some Skilling Australia Fund levy, which is essentially just a tax. And what we've found, it is actually been cause for pause, but the people there's still skill shortages. There's still, people need physical workers, but also what it's done, it's actually, from our experience, it's actually driven some industries offshore. And so, where, to your point about the remote working, people are actually looking there. So there is, when there's extra cost, obviously there's, do I absorb it? If I absorb it, I have to put up my own fees, or do I avoid it? So I'm really, I was interested to hear that you think there's an optimum point. Maybe you should speak to more governments about that optimum point, because it is an interesting conversation, right? But look, I could go on about this all day and talk with you all day. I found that the call fascinating. I really have loved your insights and appreciated your time and your knowledge and just sharing. And I think that what it sort of says to me is that mobility practitioners who are running programs, whether it's a localized program or a global program, have to probably adjust their program settings to counter for economies that are doing well compared to those who aren't doing well. If I have to send someone to a country that hasn't done so well, then do I have to look at different incentives to get them there? Conversely, or adversely, I suppose, do we also look and say, how do we attract and retain from other countries who may not have dealt with COVID so well? I think that ultimately it is still a competitive market. I think the niceties will last to a point, but the reality is in the states of skill shortages, it sounds like those economies who have vaccinated well and have done well will probably emerge with the upper hand. So, but look, thanks so much for your time. It's been absolutely insightful. As usual, I love talking to you and really appreciate your time.
Thank
Jamie,
you from
great
me
pleasure.
too. Thank you from me too, Roger. Somebody who doesn't have a strong economics background, you explained it really well. So thank you so much.
Keryn, great to chat to you. Jamie, as always, good on you, mate, and keep safe, and really appreciate the opportunity. Enjoyed the conversation very much.
No problems. All right. Good luck with it all.
Take care,
Thank
Roger.
you. Go well.
Keep safe.
See you. Okay. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.